Well, welcome everybody. So I'm Jane Golding, Chair of the Community Archives and Heritage Group, and it's wonderful to have so many people join us today. I believe we had over 200 people signed up. I'm not sure how many now are in the room. Hopefully we'll get close to that number because I know a few people are going to join a bit later. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our annual conference. Those of you who've been with CARS for a while will know that our conference is usually an all-day in-person event, often hosted at University College London, although Glasgow and Birmingham have been recent venues. And a highlight of our conference is the award ceremony, where we celebrate the dedication, innovation and expertise of community archives and heritage groups right across the UK. But for obvious reasons, we moved our conference online last year, and we felt the same format was best for this year, with proceedings held over 2 separate events. Therefore, the award ceremony will take place in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 27th of October, starting at 5 p.m. Please do join us, and we'll put details for signing up for this event in the chat. So in addition to hearing the winning groups at that event, we will have the first showing of a new film that we've made about CARS and all our wonderful member groups. And we've made this recently with the help of Kirklees Local TV, and we're very excited about sharing that with you. Then next year, we do hope to be back face-to-face for the conference, possibly in Ireland, and we'll consider running this as a hybrid event. But before that, we have a sister conference to this evening on the 10th of November in Glasgow, and the theme is sustainable stories. And the event will be both in person and online. Again, you should be able to find the details in the chat. I'm not seeing anything coming up on chat, but I believe, Alan, you're busy putting those links in for us. Brilliant. And if you haven't signed up to receive our regular newsletter, which gives details of all of these events and other news, then please do so, because CARS is free to join. We also maintain an interactive online directory of community archives across the UK. And if your group isn't already represented, we'd be really pleased to have it included. So on to this evening's event. We have an excellent lineup of speakers who will be giving us a varied and thoroughly interesting response to the theme of communities, sustainable environments and heritage. As the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, is hosted in Glasgow next month, and is billed as our last hope to avert environmental disaster, it's clear that every one of us needs to rise to the challenge. By taking the experiences, ideas and research shared by the speakers this evening, it's our hope that you will explore further, and together we can find ways to help create the change that's so urgently needed. So as Andrew mentioned, we're recording tonight's session and it'll be later available to view on our website. And we're going to continue adding useful material around climate and environmental change to the resources section of the website. And if you'd like to tell us about any of your positive actions for change, however small, we'd be very happy to share these in the next and subsequent CARS newsletters. Now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Hannah Fluck, who is Head of Environmental Strategy at Historic England. I was thrilled when Hannah agreed to speak because I know she's hugely enthusiastic and passionate about not only heritage and climate change, but also about communities. Hannah is going to share with us why the past is essential for a sustainable future of our places. Before I hand over to Hannah, let me tell you a little bit about her. So Hannah is Head of Environmental Strategy at Historic England, and she's an archaeologist with a PhD in the archaeology of human evolution and over 20 years of experience of archaeology and heritage management in research, commercial and public sectors. For the past 6 years, Hannah has worked at Historic England, overseeing its work on climate change, increasing awareness of the relevance of heritage to climate change policy and action, and has become a leading voice on the subject. Hannah is a founding steering committee member of the Climate Heritage Network, contributing author for UK Climate Change Risk Assessment, and author of Historic England's Climate Change Adaptation Report. She is a co-investigator on two HRC-funded research projects on heritage and climate change, and an advisor on a number of other climate-related initiatives. So thank you, Hannah, and over to you.
Thank you ever so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and a real honour. Looking forward to the rest of the speakers. There's an excellent lineup. I am going to really inexpertly try and share my screen now. Hopefully you can now see my slides. Is that what everyone's seeing?
That's great. Yeah, that's
excellent. So I was going to say, I can't see the chat and I can't see anyone's faces, so shout out. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about something that I know fills many of us with a sense of dread. It makes me quite anxious. It can cause that feeling of sort of helplessness in the face of overwhelming, depressing news headlines, quite frankly. I'm going to struggle to make my slides move on now, aren't I? No, there you go. There's some depressing news headlines for you. And it can be really easy to feel totally overwhelmed, feel like you need to go and change, retrain, become a climate scientist, or do something else in order to help society and the world address these sorts of challenges. And what I want to do this evening is to sort of convince you that perhaps you have already got some of the skills that you need to help people, to help society, and to help the world tackle some of these challenges. And you don't need to go and retrain, and actually you're much better off with your involvement with local community heritage, your work in archives, and using those skills and bringing those to bear. So let's see if I can manage that. Hopefully you feel a little bit more confident by the end of it. But first, I want you to take a trip back in time with me. We're going back to the 1990s. I have a horrible feeling that I expected this image to spin in, and now the next time I click, it's going to do a weird spinny thing. So I'm going to click just to get that over and done with, to give that impression of going back. So you're in a school somewhere in Hampshire. It actually could be anywhere in the UK, and the children learning about greenhouse gases, about global warming, and about the environmental threats to our planet from burning fossil fuels. I'm a girl sat in that classroom, and I can distinctly remember being taught all of those things. 30 years ago, I was part of a generation, and we were told that we were the future, that the adults of that generation needed to act in order they didn't pass on environmental problems to their children, and that we needed to learn about those past environmental mistakes so that me and my generation when we grew up didn't repeat some of those problems. But today I hear exactly the same conversations. I have the same conversations with my children, and it's extremely frustrating looking back at 30 years of environmental science, of research, of conversations about how we need to do something. I think today there's a greater sense of urgency, but essentially it's still the same conversation. We're still talking about the future as if it's a distant thing that might not arrive. And yeah, we didn't really get the flying cars that we were promised. And to be honest, a lot of the things that we have got, I think my 11-year-old self would have had her mind well and truly blown by. But I really didn't think that in 30 years' time, we would be having those same conversations. I would be talking about those same environmental issues with my children. So why is this? What went wrong? Why are we still struggling to work out how we can act? So I'm going to be a bit provocative with this. Hopefully there's not too many climate scientists and environmental scientists in the room, but you know, it's good to give them a prod every now and then. So I mean, you're looking at this is just 7 years worth of a handful of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that have come out. These are just a fraction of the incredible information that exists on anthropogenic climate change. The evidence is overwhelming. The information we have is extraordinarily detailed. And I think for many years, people thought that what was needed was more evidence. If only people could see more evidence, if only there were better models, if only people could understand the science better, if only people would just see more science, more reports, more evidence, then they'd act, they'd understand, and they would act. But no matter how many more models, no matter how fancy the models have got, how much more data and evidence is written into reports, people aren't acting. So what's missing? And this is where I think you come in. So a lot of research on some of the gaps and why people don't act, even when there's overwhelming science. There's a lot of that also relevant to the experiences that we've all had over the past couple of years with COVID as well. And at the heart of it, it comes down to people, that people are not logical. People are not naturally drawn to ever more information. We have a limit to what we can take in. When we're confronted with miserable disaster, we tend to want to run away and hide, especially if we're not affected by that directly ourselves. And so in many ways, the time is very ripe for the Climate Heritage Network and the messages that they and others are promoting around the human solutions that we need to this anthropogenic problem. And I absolutely love the catchphrase that we have in the Climate Heritage Network that to solve an anthropogenic problem, we need human solutions. So the people that are missing from all that evidence, all that data, are the people who understand people. The people who can tell the stories of people, the humanities and the human sciences. So I think there's a huge amount that we can offer. And to give a flavour of the sorts of impacts that we can have, there is, can you still see my screen? Oh. Sorry, I think my computer decided to have a wobbly and get rid of my screen, which wasn't very helpful.
Yeah, we've got just you now, Hannah, I'm afraid.
Okay. Let's see if I can. Is that back?
Yep, that's back.
Yeah, sorry, that will teach me to try and be clever and use 2 screens. Okay, wrong. Anyway, so we're talking about the human solutions and the information that we can bring. We also need to remember that thinking about this heritage angle, this culture, it's actually all about the future. So it makes us even more relevant than just bringing that human angle to bear on this. It's about what it is that we are going to pass between generations. What is our legacy? Is our legacy climate change? Is it other things? How do we pack our cultural suitcase for the future? How do we value these things? How do we understand what's important about them? And how do we make the most of our heritage for the future? So I like to think of it as a bit of a cultural toolkit for the climate crisis, the different ways in which the skills that we have as people who are expert in the past, that are actually very relevant to tackling some of these environmental challenges. I really tried to do a word cloud that didn't look really naff, and I think I failed, so apologies. It didn't like the way in which I was weighting the words, so you can peer at your screen, you might see some other words in there, but the main issues are around time, memory, places, knowledge, but most importantly it all centers around people. Everything we do is about people, and I think that is our superpower, really. So I want to look at a few of these. So first, the toolkit for the climate crisis. I think one of our special offerings is time travel. So we're all pretty good at helping people travel through time, to think about places in the past and people in the past. And if you can take people to the past, then you can help them. The DeLorean goes to the future as well as the past. But that ability to take yourself out of the present, to remember that things have been different, and to help people imagine and engage with a world in which things were different, is really valuable when you're trying to get people to imagine a future, which, let's face it, is quite challenging. I wanted to do a bit of a thought experiment. I've noticed, I don't want any spoilers, but I suspect that some of my fellow speakers are better with things that actually manage to poll the audience. I was interested in the sorts of timeframes that people think about, because I have a bit of a theory that those of us working with heritage are perhaps able to cope with or routinely think in longer timeframes. I'm a bit ridiculous because I studied the past of the Paleolithic, so I can think in hundreds of thousands of years quite comfortably, which I appreciate isn't normal, but I'm interested in, so maybe have a think about the sort of timeframes that you can think back in, and then whether you can think into the future in those timeframes, whether that helps. Kind of curious to see whether that's there's a difference between us and perhaps people who aren't routinely engaged with the past. So the other thing that I think we're particularly good at is around remembering, but also losing things. A lot of the things that we remember are things that have been lost, things that have gone. So I've got a photo there, pictures of Mermaid Rock on the Isle of Wight. When I was a child, I used to holiday on the Isle of Wight very regularly, and me and my brothers used to go and wander at low tide. It was fun. And on a super spring tide, you'd go and stand under Mermaid Rock, under the arch, and see you can find sort of shellfish and crabs and things. It collapsed probably longer ago than I'd like to remember, and you can no longer do that. But in my head, when I think of Freshwater Bay on the Isle of Wight, Mermaid Rock's still there. My memories of that place are not of it how it is today. And when I visit it today, I can still picture and imagine and retain those memories and that connection with that place with something that's now gone. So we're much better at that connecting than I think we often give ourselves credit for. But also, as in terms of archives and heritage, that's exactly what we do. We help people remember. We engage with those things that matter to us. We save those memories and we retain that information. But also, another strand to this losing. There's a kind of thought experiment, and there's a webpage associated with it, or probably a couple. If your home is burning, what is it that you save? What are the things that matter to you? They're not going to be, normally, for a lot of people, they're not the most expensive things. They're not the most valuable things. But they're the things that have an emotional attachment, a thing that connects us to other people or to places or to things in our past. And I think the same is with our cultural heritage. So when the planet's burning, what do we save? And how do we save it? And how do we remember it? And for those of us who work in and around heritage, particularly those who are very close to the communities whose heritage it is, we are very well equipped to help people think about what we save, think about how we save that, what that means, even when things might be physically gone. How we can learn from that memory. So I've just referenced a research project there that I'm involved with Caitlin De Silva at Exeter University, around landscape futures, looking at how we can manage loss in that landscape. And there's a paper that's just come out in reference to that might be of interest to you. Another thing is around knowledge. So I mentioned that with that kind of retaining information about things that are lost. But we also are a huge repository of knowledge of things that we may have forgotten we even knew. So anyone who's ever rummaged through an archive will have discovered all sorts of wonderful gems of things that nobody knew, that anybody knew, but are there. They're retained for information. That knowledge is still accessible. And that knowledge is from a pre-carbon era. A lot of what we know about living sustainability is embedded in what we used to know. We might have forgotten, or we think about it differently. And maybe now's the time to start to revisit some of that. How might it be relevant? You're going to hear from Alice in a moment, and actually that's part of what we've been trying to do with the Clandid project that she will talk about. Also, that knowledge is about places. It's very specific often to very local places, and that local knowledge, that vernacular heritage is is developed to cope and engage with those environments in those places, to connect those people with those places. And that's a really important factor when it comes to thinking about things like our resilience to future climate. So not only do we have information about how people lived in a pre-carbon era, but we also have information about how people could respond to and live with some of the environmental challenges that we will be facing increasingly with climate change. And also about the transfer of that knowledge, how that information, expertise and knowledge is transferred between generations, which is another really critical strand if we're thinking about how we can be resilient as a society for the future. Another strand, stories. I think stories are really underestimated sometimes. We forget actually what we are good at is telling those stories about people and their places through time. They'll be different for different people, different in different places. And I really love the work that Marcy Rotman's done on this. I've sort of included a reference to that National Park Service Cultural Resources Climate Strategy that she produced quite a few years ago, which I think was the first reference to climate stories. But she says that every place has a climate story. And I think that's very true. And in the Clandidge project that you'll hear about in a minute, we're trying to unpick some of the climate stories of those places. So think about the climate stories of your places. How has the climate changed through time? How will it change in the future? What have people done in the past to respond to those challenges, those environmental changes? What might be relevant to the future climate stories of your place, and how will you use your stories? I also want to just flag something that the Historic Environment Forum is producing. It's due to be launched next week. There's a collection of stories, climate stories from around England, which will be published in a report called Heritage Responds to I think it's on Tuesday next week, along with a story map, which you can interact with and connect with different examples of how the historic environment and community heritage has responded and engaged with climate change. The other thing I think is quite important is the ability to listen to different voices. So it's very easy to end up with quite a dominant narrative of the way things are. And I think maybe that's one of the challenges around that the issue around communicating that environmental science. So if we accept that people value different things, people perceive change in different ways, we need to be able to listen to that and understand that, and not assume that there's a single route through, not assume that there's a single way of seeing the world. And I think we know that when you work with heritage and when you're engaged with communities, you know that there are some things in common and there are some things that vary. But also between sectors. And I think as professionals within that space, we can be very easily forget that actually what we think might be particular challenges or what we think might be particularly important for a community might not actually be the case. And the only way you know is if you ask people. You don't know what other people are thinking unless you ask them. And I think we need to be better at listening and asking to help navigate the ways in which people are perceiving the changes and the challenges that we're facing and what it is they value, and going back to that idea of what it is that they would want to rescue from the burning planet and take forward, to not make assumptions that we know what those are. So just flagging here some work that my PhD student Tanya Ventura is doing. She's looking at how we might use something called interactive documentaries. So this is bringing together different materials, video format, to provide find a way to present different voices and different opinions and different engagements and relationships with historic places that are under threat of loss, to allow us to hear those without making a single narrative or a single route through that in terms of decision making, that you can allow for those different perspectives to exist at once in one place. And again, she's got a paper that's very recently out looking at some aspects of that. She always describes it as being like a choose your own adventure book. So you have that information, but you can navigate it like those sort of old choose your own adventure books, which I used to read when I was kids. I'm sure a few other of you will be familiar with them. So finally, there's another kind of aspect of the toolkit, which I think is absolutely essential when it comes to climate change. So a lot of those strands and tools that I've been talking about and our special powers are related to a very local area. That local knowledge, that idea of understanding, valuing local knowledge and the communication with people in particular places. But climate change is a global challenge. The climate that we will experience in our places will not be the climate that we have previously experienced, that any people have previously experienced in those places. There may be some similarities. There may be places that continue to flood, for instance. But for many of us, I live on the south coast of England, so my climate's going to be really different from anything that has previously existed in England. So we need to start talking globally, sharing that local knowledge, but learning at a global scale from each other. And I think at the beginning, Jane, you mentioned that kind of share your stories no matter small. I would say how small. I would say, and absolutely, there are some real gems that are coming out through the Climate Heritage Network of examples of really sort of small scale and local engagement of valuing and understanding some local knowledge, understanding that relationship in the past, present and future, that traditional understanding of places and buildings and people, which are really making a difference. But actually, globally, what we might be able to learn from each other is enormous. So that idea of thinking local and learning global, I think, is a pretty important one. So I like to always bring Lego into these things. I unashamedly stole this from Neil Redfern, my former colleague at Historic England, now at the Council for British Archaeology. And I borrowed his Lego analogy for heritage, and I've sort of taken it a few steps further. I'm trying to break the Lego analogy, I suppose. So he says that, the Lego movie, I'm sure more of you than want to admit it have seen it. If you haven't, go watch it. It's very good, I think, with an annoying, catchy song, admittedly. But there's a dad in the movie who's the villain. So the dad has the super glue. He builds the kits and then he fixes them. And that's it. And the kid isn't allowed to play with them until he's old enough not to smash them up. But the hero of the story, Emmett, becomes a master builder, which means he can use the skills learned in building those kits to adapt the bricks and use that knowledge to adapt to any situation that is thrown at him. And the film is about a kind of journey to the point where the dad realizes that perhaps the glue isn't the way, and there is something to be said for actually playing and using Lego creatively. And I also heard a story, someone was telling me about a parent who was complaining that their children were getting older. The Lego they wanted for Christmas and birthdays was getting ever more complicated, and they had to stay up all night building these Lego kits for them on the eve of either Christmas or a birthday. I remember being horrified. That's not the point of Lego. I mean, I must admit, I do like to build my kids' Lego kits, and I'm very happy if they want me to take over for a short while, but I wouldn't dream of building it for them in advance. And so one of the things that Neil said about the Lego movie analogy that I would draw onto that parent analogy as well is that, are we a bit like, or people think we're a bit like, the dad fixing things, fixing the kits the same, or are we a bit like the parent? We're like, actually, no, we know best. Let us do that for you. Now, sometimes that's appropriate, but actually, what would happen if we used our knowledge, if we started sharing the huge amount of information, all of those special powers or parts of the toolkit that I was talking about earlier, more widely, bringing people into that knowledge and helping people, empowering them to use their knowledge about their places to share it with each other, to help them prepare for the future. Can we be more like Emmett, and can we use the skills that we have from that traditional knowledge, from our heritage and from our local knowledge to adapt to an unfamiliar future? So a few conclusions and challenges, I suppose. I always like to give people some homework. Hopefully you're a little bit more convinced that you have some skills that are relevant to climate action, to adapting to that new future and to reducing our carbon. That expertise in the past, how we rediscover or engage with lost knowledge, how we connect or reconnect with places, and that telling of human stories, they're all essential for our future, and we're going to need them more than ever. And heritage is really relevant. It's sometimes seen as a barrier to sustainability. I hear that a lot, actually. But it really doesn't need to be. It's very much part of a sustainable future. And we will lose things. We are facing unprecedented rates of change. But losing isn't necessarily failing. And again, we've got those skills to navigate some of those changes and challenges and think about how we remember. And yes, we're going to need to prioritize the things that we look after and we save, that cultural suitcase that I mentioned right at the beginning, the idea of what we save for the burning planet. But actually, in doing so, we've really got to listen to the things that people value and the different perspectives that people have. And that's where that community engagement and understanding comes into play as well. And finally, it's really about empowering people to champion their local heritage, to see the value in that for their sustainable future, and to really help make the most of it, to make the decisions that will see us through to a low carbon and a sustainable future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was really really inspiring and really eye-opening in terms of thinking about how heritage and the knowledge that we all hold and engage with can contribute. I think we've probably got a minute or two for one or two questions to ask. The first thing I'd just like to note is that there's been a request from somebody in the audience if you could post some of the links to some of the research and things that you were talking to, particularly the link to the study that you talked about, the referencing memory. That would be really helpful. So is there anybody who wants to kind of turn on their camera, turn on their microphone, and ask Hannah a question on what she's just been talking about? Or while people are thinking, I just wondered whether you could just take it down into kind of a real practical kind of term and just give us an example that you've come across of where that local knowledge has really contributed to that understanding of the difficulties that we face, but also help towards a solution.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number. I think there's some really nice examples around a lot of our knowledge of the built environment. I must admit that we probably spent a little bit longer looking at that than perhaps some of the other archive information, particularly in areas that have experienced flooding. My colleagues at Historic England, our building conservation, did some brilliant work looking at how buildings recovered in, I think it was the Hebden Bridge area in the north of England, and found that actually those places that had used traditional materials, provided they were maintained and looked after, recovered a hell of a lot quicker than those with modern materials, and actually through lab experience as well demonstrated why the use of some of those traditional materials really helped. And subsequently there's been some work with a local building firm in Appleby, looking at how to refurbish a house that was very badly affected by flooding, but using entirely the traditional materials, and the builder in question was very keen to start sharing that knowledge locally about the use of some of those materials. Very practical way to really get a greater understanding of that. Sort of on another end of the spectrum, there's work that we've been doing with a company called Fjorda with Anthony and Emma Firth, which relates to the project that Alice is going to talk about in a minute as well. But a lot of the work that they've been doing on historic watercourses and looking at how archive material as well as archaeological evidence can really demonstrate how unnatural many of our watercourses are, and therefore how local how that affects how the hydrology and the flood risks might play out. But actually what they're also finding is that using that information provides a way in for a lot of local communities to to share their experiences of, oh yes, now that field's always flooded. That's actually where the old mill was, something along those lines. So it can be a way of opening up some of those conversations. And I think the experiences of those agencies who've been working alongside those projects is that they've been extremely positive ways of bringing in information they hadn't previously thought about using.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands raised, but we're already we're just at the time for the next talk. So could I ask those people to, if they don't mind, if they put their questions in the chat, we'll see if we can return to those questions. There's one other just saying, can you please include a reference to Watercourse work in the posting of your links? And yes, we will be. We will collate all those links and make them available via the website, the web page for this conference as well.
Yeah, okay. and I should also say I'm really interested to hear about the examples that people might have about how they can see how their local heritage and archive information can really help. I think often people think it's not big enough or big enough scale, but actually what we're learning is that it's that local knowledge and that local engagement that could really make a difference. So please get in touch and let us know.
Thank you very much. I mean, people can show their appreciation by pressing the clap emojis and the waving emojis, and we'll move on. Thank you very much, Hannah. That was great. So our next speaker is Dr. Alice Harvey Fishenden, and she's going to be speaking on archives and communities as repositories of climate change knowledge. Alice is a historical geographer with experience of working across a variety of disciplines, including English, history, archaeology, physical and human geography. Her PhD research at the University of Liverpool focused on developing a better understanding of the societal impacts of droughts in the past and how archive documents can be used to learn more about droughts and other extreme weather conditions. And she is now a postdoctoral research associate currently working on the AHRC UK Climate Resilience Programme funded project Clandage, Building Climate Resilience Through Community, Landscapes and Cultural Heritage. And welcome, Alice.
Thank you. So you were breaking up a little bit there. I don't know if it's my connection or yours. I hope it's not my connection. I hope everybody can hear me, see me. I'll try and share my screen now.
Yeah, you're coming through clear. It's probably mine. Sorry.
Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen and that's the right screen and that's in presented mode.
That's all good. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming today. It's lovely to see so many people here. And today I'm going to talk about my research over the last 5 years, working with communities and archives to explore the past and future of our climate. Hannah has hopefully persuaded you that you can help as people involved, interested, and with expertise in heritage and practical ideas for things you can do in my talk. So climate history is often a bit overlooked, I think, and marginalised. And it's sort of become detached from communities, from landscapes, and from the consequences of when we look at weather records, and we don't always think about the consequences. But I think climate history is public history. It's as important as histories of health, places, and families. And climate and extreme weather have shaped how we live, the food we eat, the buildings we live in, the clothes we wear. And if predictions are right, adverse climatic conditions and extreme weather events are going to become more frequent and a much bigger part of our lives in the future. However, as much as the media loves to describe weather as unprecedented, everything is apparently unprecedented. Very little is actually without precedent if we're prepared to look far enough into the past. So old documents can tell us about past weather extremes and how people coped with them. And people from the past still have really important stories to tell, and human accounts are the only way of contextualizing possible scenarios in a way that everybody can understand. As Hannah was talking about, the numbers don't mean all that much all on their own, and there's only so much science can actually explain in a practical sense. Recently, I've been working with Historic England on a series of videos about climate change and cultural heritage. And the one I'm just finishing at the moment about climate change and historic buildings has highlighted to me that a lot of the adaptation and climate resilience can come from low-tech solutions and thoughtfully considering how things were done in the past and what we can learn from the past. Ooh. Okay, so my talk today will encompass my PhD work with the Staffordshire Record Office on historic flooding and drought in Staffordshire, and my current work on the Clandidge project, where once again the Staffordshire Record Office is one of the project partners, but as part of a much bigger project involving academics from 3 universities, Historic England, the museums and archives out in the Outer Hebrides, and the contractor Fjorda, who Hannah's mentioned. My PhD was a AHRC funded collaborative doctoral award, and my current project is also funded by the AHRC, but as part of the wider UK Climate Resilience Programme. During my PhD, I worked with a group of volunteers to explore evidence of past droughts within the archives and travelled around Staffordshire, giving talks to local societies. And my talk today is mostly going to focus on Staffordshire, but as Hannah's already mentioned, we're doing all sorts of interesting things up in the Even Valley as well, which are also kind of relevant. Part of the remit of my PhD project was to explore the MLA and Collection Trust's Revisiting Archives Toolkit and see how it could be used for climate research and looking at environmental information in the archives. So there are loads and loads of things I wanted to try with my PhD project, but only so much one person can get done in 3 years. So it was really great that I've had the chance to go back to Staffordshire in this project and expand on my earlier work and re-engage with similar archive material in different ways and under very different circumstances. While the pandemic has not been ideal for community-based activities, it has pushed us to explore new avenues, which we'd not necessarily have considered before, such as oral histories via Zoom, online poetry workshops, holding events outside. So we've basically put together a programme of activities that can be accessed in multiple ways and which don't necessarily mean meeting face-to-face or in large groups or indoors. And in some ways, as it turns out, this hybrid model is quite suited to our research, particularly when I was doing droughts. I found people really didn't want to talk to me very much. People don't realise the wealth of climate weather information they actually have. And I found people are much more comfortable agreeing to talk to me over Zoom, where they don't have to make the effort to come out, leave their house. It's easier and lower commitment. So my projects I'm going to talk about are far from the first to engage with archive material around climate. There's a whole discipline of historical climatology, which does things like recovering historical weather and climate information from archives, often in the form of harvest dates or formal weather diaries. However, historical climatologists very rarely engage with local communities and rarely use less formal records because of concerns over consistency. But I've been able, through my work with Staffordshire, to do some work which has shown that there are ways of using these less formal records, such as personal diaries, to reconstruct weather. And I can put a link to my paper in the chat if anybody's interested. And I've also shown that collecting this kind of information is the ideal activity to get communities, to get people involved with. So diaries, so personal diaries, are generally interesting and engaging and have material of interest beyond the weather information. My volunteers in Staffordshire were doing far more than just data entry. They were reading about and discussing reports on current events and the way of life in the 18th and 19th century, and enjoying looking at material that they otherwise wouldn't have thought to look for in an archive. From my point of view, working with volunteers also allowed me to gather far more information than it would be possible to collect otherwise, and far more of this qualitative personal diary-based information that anybody's ever collected before. And that's I've shown really important, because if we use these daily accounts of weather to build a picture of climate, the more records you have from a similar location, the easier it is to build an accurate picture. I also think it's really important, and found it was really important, to carry out this knowledge with the local community, with people who know about the local environment, because numbers only tell a small part of the story. And when a single researcher, such as most historical climatologists, sits in an archive poring over documents about weather information or climate proxies, they miss out on that local knowledge. And we really shouldn't separate weather from community and from landscape. When we work with large amounts of climate data, places become just a dot on the map. And since we often look at timescales beyond human lifespan, it can feel like individuals become inconsequential. Across 100 years or more of climate data, it's really hard to get your head around the impacts of the events you're looking at had on real people. In addition to working alongside volunteers as part of both of these projects, I've been presenting archive documents to the modern day communities that they relate to. And this has been done in multiple forms, from bringing people into the record office for study days, to talking to local societies and local groups, which some of you may be involved with, and integrating documents into creative workshops, either as printed material for crafting, as you see in the bottom left of my screen, or as discussion material in poetry workshops. As I'm sure you're aware, the cataloguing of county archives is far from exhaustive, and was normally done with administrative, legal, or family and local history needs in mind. And it can be quite hard to find weather, climate, or other environmental information in the archive catalogues. Additionally, there's loads of aspects which are not captured well by the formal record. Obviously, there's a huge bias towards the survival of material belonging to big landowners and companies, and that's been really apparent in the diary and the letter material I was looking at with the volunteers. And that's why we've been really interested in capturing reflections on archive documents and additional local knowledge not captured in this record in a range of forms, from creative responses like these plant pots and labels, to oral histories, to giving the volunteers a copy of the catalogue entry to annotate and add to. And we're working with the archivists at Stafford to preserve this material, which complements and adds to the existing collections. My research across both these projects, and this is just the way I've been thinking about it recently, and it's still sort of conceptual ideas in progress, it's involved a cycle of archival data collection, community engagement through presenting and manipulating material, community data collection, and re-engaging with the archive through catalogue improvements or the addition of material. In the research I'm doing, the documents I find in the archive are used to extract qualitative descriptions of weather and environment, which are then sometimes turned into qualitative indices, and then these qualitative indices are explained using the qualitative information, revisiting that. And the original source material and resulting analysis are presented to community groups and discussed using creative activities, resulting in new insights which are recorded in written form and as oral histories. These are then reintegrated into the archive, and I'm really grateful to the team at Stafford for being so willing and interested to explore alternative ways of working with their archive material. I think the things that we've learned, which, from this multi-layered interaction with the archives, which have relevance beyond what we've done. And whilst the Revisiting Archives Toolkit as a whole wasn't really applicable to the kind of research we were doing, we've taken a lot of inspiration and ideas from it, and considered archives as living, evolving things. I studied medieval manuscripts as part of my undergrad degree, and I love how they're living documents with layers of annotation and reworking. And I like to think how we can have living archives where, although I'm not advocating getting a pen and scribbling all over them with our own thoughts directly onto the document, there is space to incorporate new material where relevant, bringing up and highlighting things which may not be covered in the superficial catalogue description. In the end, however, archives aren't really the important thing. The end goal is helping communities adapt to climate change. As the Environment Agency report, which was heavily covered in the media yesterday, which seems to have dropped off the face of the earth today, stated quite clearly the consequences of not adapting to climate change could be deadly. And it's very important to be able to explain the risks. And historic documents with people's accounts of past extremes on a local level might be a way of doing this. And in a dynamic, changing climate, it's really important to record our community's memories of weather and seasons, because it's not going to be the same in the future. There is valuable information in local, community and national archives and uncollected within communities for exploring past and possible future experiences of climate change and extreme weather. And these have the potential to engage people with their local environment and global climate. I'm aware of not being presenting anything in the way of results here really, but hopefully we can start a conversation about archives, community and climate. I hope I might have given you some food for thought. So yeah, what can you do? You can keep your eyes out for diaries which record the weather. I'm particularly interested in pre-1850, but obviously with a changing climate, everything's interesting. Or you could start keeping one yourself. And if you're doing anything in the way of collecting oral histories, maybe consider asking about climate and weather memories. Climate change is happening, and although we can't give up on technological solutions, we need to consider our adaptation, and in doing that we should look to the past, to our buildings, our rivers, our archives, archaeology, to explain how communities cope with extreme weather in the past. And even if circumstances are not transferable, the power of stories, of contextualizing climate change within the local environment can and will help people to understand the risks of extreme weather. So this is my final slide. I've just got a little animation I did of one of our workshops building bird boxes, which I'll leave up just for a second.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was again really brilliant, and just goes to show the kind of the amount of different materials that can be found and can be useful for this kind of research and this kind of work. Can you just say a little bit? This is a question asking you if you can elaborate on how archival descriptions were enhanced, and did you use techniques such as tagging, drought, extreme weather, and also draw on any other collaborative paradigms other than the Revisiting Archives toolkit?
Yeah, so this was a bit of a, we spent a long time debating with the archivists at Stafford about what was the best thing to do. So there were, I haven't quite talked about it here, but there were two sides to this project, the flood side and the drought side. And I'm drought, and I had a colleague who was flood. Basically, for the drought point of view, for the drought records, tagging, so drought as it appears in archives is a bit complicated because you very rarely identify a drought as it's happening. So you'll very rarely get archive documents which are directly related to drought. So it's not really relevant to do tagging with drought. My colleague Helen, who was working with flooding, found there were far more appropriate things to tag, and she did do some tagging. But from my part, from my side of the project, it was mostly working with my volunteers, revisiting the descriptions.
Okay, Jonathan, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. That was really interesting, Alice. As an oral historian, I'm really excited by your use of personal testimonies in diaries and so forth. But I'm wondering the value of that in scientific terms. Did you use official sources like the Met Office or the BBC? Because personal testimony is fine, but it's anecdotal, and that often leads to it being historically and technically inaccurate. So I'm wondering how you kind of blend the two sources.
So there's a variety of things I've done. So I have a paper which is in Climate of the Past, which is about using personal diaries for reconstructing weather patterns. And so what I did there was I used daily records to create indices, which I then correlated with the nearest instrumental weather records, which obviously for the 18th and 19th century are fairly sparse. So I did a short section in London where the records are, which was quite close to the Kew instrumental weather series, which showed quite convincingly that what I was getting from the diaries in terms of rainfall, they're not so good in terms of temperature or anything, because that is far more subjective and depending on our norms. That I could create an accurate representation of rainfall from the diaries, and then I've applied it to places slightly further away from any weather stations. I have created a technique which works in the absence of anything instrumental for the 18th and 19th century. Obviously, when you're talking about the 20th century, we have far more records, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate to try and reconstruct weather from oral histories or anything. But at the same time, I think oral histories are really important in recording just everyday interactions with weather, with floods, with climate change, and we're hoping to use some extracts from oral histories in a exhibition with the Staffordshire Record Office in the future.
We've got a question from about how did you use the archive material to make bird boxes?
So when I was going around doing talks to the public as part of my PhD, I'd photocopied a whole load of documents from the Staffordshire Record Office, and had loads of copies of them. And in this COVID environment in which we don't go wandering around talking to people and handing out pieces of paper, they were going to waste. They were just sitting there in my office in Liverpool, which I haven't been to for a year and a half. So we did this creative workshop with a artist from Stafford, and basically she had a template for a cardboard bird box, not a practical bird box, not a bird box that anything lives in. I think that's probably the key point, which we decoupaged bits of the archive documents all over.
Okay. Just briefly, because I was just really intrigued about the question of kind of finding the archives with this kind of material, the kind of records. And you mentioned diaries. Are there any other types of less formal kind of archival material used for this kind of work?
So the only thing I have really used, so obviously my focus was on the daily records when I was doing the work for my PhD, which obviously with slightly limited access to physical archives at the moment, I'm continuing to work with lots of the same source material because I've already collected it. So letters is the other one, but there's a bit of a bias with letters and with diaries that only occasionally record the weather to only record the extreme events. So I've got an example where we've got two people recording in their diaries a couple of miles apart, and one records every day, so you get fine, terrible snowstorm, fine. And whereas if you've got somebody who only records occasionally, they will only write terrible snowstorm, for example. And it's kind of the same with letters. You only mention something in a letter if it's worth mentioning.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you. That was, as I said, it was really, really fascinating, and I've several papers that I think I'm going to go and have a look through. I'm particularly interested in kind of how oral history can play a role here. So again, if people want to show their appreciation with Zoom's range of emojis, then that'll be great. And we'll move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is David Barnes, and he's going to be speaking on Am I an archive activist using connectedness to record our present and past. David's a registered social worker, and he might be an amateur archivist. He has recently completed a master's in health research, which identified the role of connectedness in people's lives, and it made him realise that a lot of his activities have important aspects of active archiving, by which he means that he is creating records that he likes to think have current interest and value in future social history value. He also combines this with practical work in heritage and wildlife conservation. Okay, so over to you, David.
Right, thank you. I feel really privileged to be here, actually, to be able to present this session. And I'm sure that I'm going to cover some ground that many people have got a lot more expertise on than I have. But I hope that as a whole, I'm providing some interesting points about my journey in terms of archiving. But also, I've asked the question, am I an archive activist? This has occurred to me recently in that I realised that although I've been a social worker and a social work manager for 30 years, throughout that time, I've been doing stuff around collecting. I'm a big old postcard collector, for example. I've been thinking about how to record those and make those available more publicly. I've been keeping a diary. I've kept a diary since 1986, virtually every day. And previous to that, I even recently refound a work diary from 1975, which was a very dry document, but still had some interest. It made me wonder whether I'm a bit of an activist as an archivist. And I think what I want to explore here is whether I'm actually helping create archives now. And I'd be interested to know what people think about that as I go through my presentation, really. So I've also raised the question of connectedness. Sorry, Andrew, can I ask, is everybody seeing my screen okay?
Yes, David, sorry, I should have said, yeah, this is all working good.
Great, thank you. Connectedness. I've recently completed a master's in health research, but I did it on green exercise, which is, I'm sure many people know, is broadly about doing exercise outdoors, and it can be running, it can be cycling, it can be walking, it can be wildlife conservation work. And several of those things I've always been very interested in, and I still get involved in very much. And one of the things that came out of my interviews with people was about how important it was, their connections with the environment, with people, with species, with habitats. Yeah, so I also have been thinking about, you know, what does being an active archivist do? And one of the things that I've always held to in my social work and more broadly in my life is the idea that if only people would connect more, we'd be a lot more happier. We'd be a lot happier, I think. And I really like that quote from E.M. Forster's Howard's End, only connect. I think that's a fantastic, very pithy statement for how we could all greatly improve our lives if only we could connect. And I think archives are a major factor in that. I've certainly discovered that, and I'm finding that even more now. I should say I retired from statutory social work 2 years ago. Unfortunately, I had a range of activities that meant that I've virtually created, albeit unpaid, another career, which I'm really enjoying. So my first archive activity was probably, I used to collect the Perishers cartoons from the Daily Mirror. I used to cut them out and I used to put them in a scrapbook. And here's Wellington. I still got those scrapbooks, of course, because I am also a bit of a hoarder as well. And Wellington, I loved Wellington because I thought, oh, he's how I would like to live my life. Here he is living on his own with his dog, completely independent. So I was intrigued by it. So I'll come back to another one of the heroes in Perishers a bit later. But that was probably my first experience of doing any archiving. I decided I was going to archive Perishers cartoons. And I've got about 3 years worth of them from the early 70s. I've tried to be a little bit more erudite in looking at this subject. And I really like this statement that I found in a fairly recent article, which was about saying, you know, along the lines of that sometimes the ephemerality, the physical ephemerality of what we're trying to archive, or perhaps because what we're trying to archive doesn't have particular or isn't recognized for its cultural merit, means that maybe it doesn't always get recorded and kept for future generations. And I have a strong sense of that. And I suppose in everything I do now, I'm trying to get beyond perhaps some of the more common types of knowledge that we record and we archive. I also had a look, because I'm doing research, I'm just about to start a PhD as well, which will be broadly on the similar lines, but I'm increasingly thinking I want to incorporate some aspect of community archiving into that research. And I've had thoughts about the way I could do that. If anybody has got any other ideas around that, I would really welcome them. But in looking at the research excellence framework, I was thinking, well, there are definitely two ways in which I would like to make an impact. And those are creating and sharing new knowledge and innovation. But also, really importantly for me, and I suppose it's partly why I became a social worker, it's about enhancing quality of life and health as well. And I see those as the drivers in what I do now. I also like to think that I can be a bit creative. And I was a little bit, I had a look at the, I'm new to a lot of the formal sort of research around community archiving. So I did a little bit of literature review and research. And I had a look at the Guide to Collaboration for Archives in Higher Education. And I did a search on the word create. And it does talk about creating an archive. It talks about using an archive for creative purposes, which they're fantastic, and creating and enhancing digitized content. But there was nothing much about creating archivable material, even though it defines collaboration as the action of working with someone to produce or create something. And I found that interesting. It made me wonder whether, well, am I really an archivist? You know, I'm trying to create records. Is that what an archivist does? Or is it that as archivists, we just record what's happened before and what's gone before and the records from the past, which I need to say I totally value, and I love old records, and I want to do more to help save them. But creativity, I would like to think that I'm trying to be creative as well in what I do. Now, this is one of the ways in which I think I'm creating archivable material. I am a big fell runner. When I say a big fell runner, I'm not a very good fell runner, but I massively enjoy fell running. I'm usually at the back of the race, and increasingly they have timeouts, so I have to do shorter ones these days. But nevertheless, I also enjoy writing about them. And one of the reasons I enjoy writing about them is I can put my name in the reports. And I think that's what my club members think is the main reason why I do it. But it honestly isn't the main reason why I do it. The main reason why I do it is I think I'm helping create an archive of activity. And I've done this for 6 years. I've done over 200, getting on for 250 weekly reports. We're fortunate in having in Bolton a daily newspaper still. And each week they will publish what I've written. And virtually they publish exactly what I've written with very little editing, which I'm always pleased about. But what I really see it as is about archiving, is about recording a particular moment in time. And I try to get as many names from our club in the articles as possible. And that really is why I do it. I do, of course, do it as well because it gets my name in there, less often now than used to. But that's one way in which I'm trying to, it's a newspaper. I believe they're all saved, stored at the British Library. So hopefully future generations will be able to use those reports to get a snapshot of sport in this local area. So that's one way in which I do that. Okay, so another way is that I'm big into wildlife conservation work. I've done wildlife conservation work for 35 years on a voluntary basis. I've always found it very relaxing and very enjoyable to do it, mainly because I like the physical work, but also because I love the landscapes. Rather weirdly, I've never got into recording wildlife, so I'm really poor on recording or identifying species. But I know that's the enjoyment that many people get from it. And the Lancashire Wildlife Trust I'm a member of, they have a blog, and I've done a few blogs for them. And those have been about, I've been trying to record colleagues, other volunteers, and their experiences of doing wildlife conservation work. So there's just 2 examples here. There are unfortunately only 5 of them in total. I'd love to do more. But that's another way in which I'm trying to record particular activities that I hope people will find interesting and will somehow continue to exist in some form, so that people can look back and say, oh, so that's what they did then, and also connect them with particular people. So I really enjoy writing about people and their experiences of life and the work they do. So this is another way in which I've been thinking, oh, yeah, I think I've been creating some archivable material. And hopefully that is what I've been doing. And hopefully it will be useful in the future. My third example is that upon retirement, my local authority very kindly allowed me to go and do green badge tour guiding, partly as my preparation for retirement. And that was, I'll give them credit, it was Salford City Council. And I mean, they were getting something out of it in the sense that they were renovating the Bridgewater Canal and the towpaths along the Bridgewater Canal in Salford. So particularly at Worsley, if people know, which is off a very close to a major junction on the M60, the one that's called the Eccles interchange, where you often hear on travel reports there's been an accident, unfortunately. But at Worsley, there is an amazing set of heritage. There's a village green that used to be an industrial workshop. Probably Worsley has got almost as big a claim to being one of the major sites for the start of the Industrial Revolution, almost as big a claim as, say, Ironbridge has. And the small picture at the left bottom here is of the Delf. And the Delf is a network of 54 miles of underground canals that used to bring the coal out onto the canal. So it's a very fascinating place. But one of the things I do there, the group picture is at St. Mark's Church, which is an amazing church because it's got an enormous number of artifacts relating to the Edgerton family, the Duke of Bridgewater and the Earl of Ellesmere, who originally owned the estate. They're no longer the owners of the estate, they've moved elsewhere in the country. But it's a really fascinating, and the graveyard is a very large graveyard with a lot of people are buried in it. And there is a local person in the area, Paul, who does a lot of work on archiving the records of those people. So it's a really fascinating place. But the one thing I've been trying to do in doing the tours is when I'm doing them, I do try to ask people to, if they wish to give some examples of, you know, what do these places mean to them? What is important to them about the heritage of these places? Because I think it's really important that, as one of our speakers earlier was saying, about it being a living archive, you know, a living archive experience. And I think that people are constantly relating to the places around them. And I want to be involved far more in recording that sort of stuff, because I think it's really important now for people's well-being, but also going forward for future generations that hopefully will be still in a position to be able to look back on, you know, our lives. So that's another way in which I like to think that I'm trying to create archivable material. Yeah, creating archivable material. Now, one of the stops on the route, you know, I'm just checking now, I'm doing for time. Okay, is that this is Worsley Courthouse, and this is a postcard from 1914. But when you look at the courthouse today, it's virtually unchanged. But I think you can see a shadow on the ground, and there are tram lines on the ground. The tram lines are obviously no longer there. They were removed in the 1950s. and it's a shadow of a building across the road. And I'm going to show you now what that building is in the next slide. So that's the building that used to be there, and that is the outline of the shape of the building that is on the shadow on the road outside the courthouse. Unfortunately, now that's gone, and the view you now get there is of the M60 interchange, because it's just across the road from the Wesley courthouse. So it's a complete change in the landscape, and I really like the idea of the landscape as an archive. So on here, I'm hoping you can see an arrow, and it's pointing towards a coat of arms. And that coat of arms is the coat of arms of the Edgerton family, specifically the Earls of Ellesmere, who owned the coal mines, and they owned the Bridgewater estate at that time. They also owned large estates elsewhere in the country. For example, in the Chilterns at Ashridge, and also in Surrey at Hatchford End. So they had land and estates in several areas, and I find that really interesting because I don't think anybody's actually done a great deal of research on, certainly with the Edgertons and the Ellesmeres in the 18th and 19th century, on connecting up that sort of widespread landowning and what it meant for those families at that time. So so having pointed out that coat of arms on that building there, as it says, that's the gateway to Worsley Hall. Worsley Old Hall does actually still exist. There were 3 halls, and the oldest one has survived, and it is a very nice building. So if you are visiting Worsley, it's a hotel and a pub, and a very nice pub, and it's about half a mile from, this is the gateway to it. The actual Old Hall is about half a mile away from this. Now, that coat of arms is now on the bridge that carries the M60 over the local roundabout, and that's it there. What's it called? The motto is, I think it's Sic Donec, which I've had to look up on the on Google to find out what it means, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But for me, this is the landscape as an archive. Somebody has made an attempt to keep a bit of the old heritage and has decided, for good or bad, and I quite like it, I have to say, they've put it in the motorway bridge structure. So we've got what many people would say is an awful looking bridge, but it's got this piece of history there still. And I really like that people have had that vision to do that. And I think a lot of that has happened and continues to happen. And I think it's brilliant that it does. I should say that if you go under this bridge here, and just on the right, the church, St. Mark's, is up on a knoll. So unfortunately, the church has been divided by the motorway from the village, but it's still a very active church. This is the, so I showed you the postcard of Worsley Courthouse, and this is the other side of that postcard. I can't see because I've got a different view on. I can't actually read what I've transcribed it. So on the right hand side, I've transcribed it. It was written from nearby Patrick in Eccles, which is not far from Worsley. And so we've got a specific address. We've also on there got a specific name of who it was sent from, Mr. Birch, I believe. And it was sent to a Mrs. Johnson, and we've got their address. And both those addresses still exist. One is in Leek, Staffordshire. And I noted the previous speaker, Alice, was talking about Staffordshire a lot. And one of the areas of research I'm keen to do is that Worsley has a lot of connections with Staffordshire, which I've not fully explored yet, but which I want to do. One of them obviously is James Brinley, the great canal builder, who spent most of his life in Leek, as it happens. And also John Gilbert, who was a designer of the canals, and he was from Staffordshire. But there are many other connections, one of them also being that Wedgwood used the canal, the Bridgewater Canal, to get his products into Manchester during the early years of the Industrial Revolution. So that's an example. Now that shows you I've got a collection of postcards, and I'm really keen to try to get them out there as a historic record, as an archive. I would welcome any comments people have got on how I might more easily do that, because I think people would find them interesting. More people would. When I go to postcard fairs, I went to one at the weekend. It seems to be an activity that is aging with me. And I really would like to think that our younger generations will also have an interest in this. And I think they will, actually, I think, as time goes on. So my final example, time, right, okay, is that I'm a member of the Manchester, Bolton and Bury Canal Society, and I'm an outreach volunteer for them. So I do a lot of work in reaching out to communities. And rather weirdly, I'm doing 2 sessions in 1 week, having never really done this before. And I'm doing one on Saturday with the Inland Waterways Association on their restoration conference. And that is about biodiversity gain, which goes back to one of the discussions earlier in this conference. So one of the things I've done with, there's a regular journal that the Society, the Manchester, Bolton and Bury Canal Society produces, and I describe some of my work, and I've recorded that in that article, and I've had 1 or 2 other articles in there as well. And again, I see that as me being active in archiving. I have had the opportunity to interview a couple of people about their experiences from many years ago of the canal and its environment, and this is where I'm slowly thinking about that. I will want to try to focus my PhD research, which is on specific green spaces and the opportunity they offer for green exercise, but also, and well-being, and also what those spaces mean to them. On the canal, we are, at the moment, there is a big planning application in. The canal actually is only about, it's less than 33% restored in water. So it's got many, many years yet before it will become a fully restored canal. So we're trying to maintain it as what we call an eco-highway, a nature recovery network, really. And we're trying to promote it in those ways. So there has recently been a planning application. And one of the things I'm aware of is that planning applications often include really detailed historical and archaeological surveys. And one of the things that the canal, the application for housing is saying is they want to use greenbelt land, and as a significant contribution, I suppose as mitigation for that, is they want to restore the breach. There's a breach in the canal. And one of our responses to the planning application is we would like to have donated to us any of the artifacts that are found in the restoration of the canal, so that we can actually store them and then make them available for display. So we're an active society that is trying to create physical objects that will be available for future generations. I'm coming back to the perishes. I can't believe how I looked at my perishes, and these were the first 2 sketches that I found when I was preparing for this. And I think they explain how, when you read it, how there can be voices that just are not allowed into the tent because they shout too loud, in the case of Maisie, who's my other hero from the Perishes, because I used to love her attitude towards the young boys in the cartoon. She didn't stand any nonsense from them generally. So here's the next one. So they tried to exclude her, but I know from the later sketches that they didn't achieve that. They might have done that on that night, but they didn't carry on excluding her. But that's only because she was very determined to get her voice heard. And I think it does take a lot of determination these days to get your voice heard. And sometimes, you know, we are at risk of not hearing voices, perhaps because they don't shout loud enough, but also because they're not regarded as culturally relevant. And when I say that, I'm really keen that we extend, you know, the the voices to everybody in society. It's fantastic that we've got the diversity that we do have in this country, and there are experiences that are really not being recorded, and I love to see them. Unfortunately, for example, the canal has a presence in an area that is very diverse ethnically, and I'm hoping that some of my research will be able to promote that aspect of it. So yeah, that's some of my ambitions. So is it a figure of speech being an archive activist? As Maisie was saying, it was only a figure of speech. So maybe it's a figure of speech that I'm an archive activist. I'll leave that for you to decide. And also whether I've made any sense at all about the idea of connectedness. But I hope I have. And I hope you found that useful. So thank you for listening. Oh, that's the motto. That, sorry, the Edgerton said. So signonic means thus until, which I always think is about, you know, saying, well, nothing much is going to change whilst we're around. But there's an alternative translation of it, until the end be happy. And I quite like that. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think definitely we would agree that that you're the embodiment of the living archivist and active archivist, and I'm really kind of interested to hear just a little bit about from what your perspective on that kind of connection between for you and others about this kind of work and well-being, and this kind of sort of sense of place and well-being. How do you see that for yourself and for others?
Well, sense of place is really important to me, yeah, totally. I don't think I can add a lot really to what you've said there, Andrew, or what I've said already. That's and whilst my master's research was about green exercise generally, I now really want to do something that identifies 2 or 3 local places, and I like the emphasis earlier from the speakers on locality, and try to focus on what do people really cherish and value from their local area, and how can we get those views more readily recognised by authorities, really, so that they help better shape the experiences that people have of their local areas.
Yeah, and there's a comment actually talking about the reflecting on the motorway plaque, talking about the kind of thinking about why people have emotions about historic places and what sort of places they value, and those places that may not be considered historically significant enough to be listed. So perhaps this can also inform consideration about how communities want to remember places that are lost or in danger, but landscapes are perhaps overlooked. I think that's the kind of sort of really interesting connections there. And so somebody else has said that the idea of the archive activist is great. The decision over whose stories shouldn't be not told seems to be a political thing, but it's also something that as active archivists we can make a difference in. And I think, you know, what you're doing to try and create those stories is very much within that framework. Does anyone else have a comment or a question before we say thanks to David and go to a break? Bob.
Yeah, hi, Andrew, and hi, David. Thanks for the presentation. If you can hear me, I was just picking up on one thing you said, I suppose, when you're talking about the postcards and your confidence that I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, confidence that future generations will still be interested in such projects. And I don't disagree with you. I'm probably not as positive as you sounded. I'm sure there are ways that we can engage with younger generations, particularly, and at a young, or getting younger people engaged at an earlier age. But I'm interested in with younger generations. you know, a lot of what we're talking about, connectedness and sense of place, these are kind of things we don't tend to think about or consider until later in life. I say later in life, basically not when we're young people. So what makes you so confident that young people and future generations will engage in the types of work that we're all here and interested in?
A couple of things, really. Thanks for that, Bob. Interesting question. A couple of things. Some of it is from my experience as a social worker, and I know that people are really attached to where they come from. And I think that I agree that I think it's a thing that becomes materialized as people get older. And they reflect more on that as they get older. But it was very obvious to me, even with younger families, how attached they were to the areas, and that those areas were very important to them. So that's one of the reasons why I think I have a bit of confidence. The other is that with the Canal Society, we have done some work with schools, and they definitely, and I have to, you know, compliment the teachers. It's the way they teach it as well. So children have been involved in a couple of projects on the canal, which have been they've been very place specific. And it's just been the responses of those children to those activities and how they've recorded their experiences of those activities says to me, now that those are primary school children. So it may be, and the group we've not been able to reach yet, and I've not in this, you know, more recent years been able to make contact with, is the teenage, the high school group, and maybe they wouldn't be quite so attached to the area, but I don't know. I certainly think primary school children are, and I think that later on in life they recall those experiences, and it stays with them, and they come back to it.
Great. Thank you very much. I think give the customary wave to David, and thank him very much for that contribution, which was really fascinating. And let's take a short break. We're going to come back and start again at 6:45. And we'll then be hearing from Dr. Tim Powell and Georgie Salzedo from the National Archives. So we'll see you in just a few minutes. Off you go. I see that you put your Menti link and code in the chat, so people should also have a look at that if they're not. So the next talk, we're very grateful to have two speakers from the National Archives, Tim Powell and Georgie Salzedo. Georgie joined the National Archives as a sectoral development manager for London and the Business Archives in 2019. She previously worked as an archivist in a business and completed an MA in archives at UCL. I remember well. She's also done an MA in public history. After completing a PhD in early medieval history, Tim Powell forgot all about it and worked for 20 years on modern scientific archives. He's been at the National Archives since 2012 and is the sector development manager for the Southwest, Religion and Science and Technology. And they're speaking on All Is Hazard, Is There No Plan? A risk assessment to archives and climate change. And thank you very much.
I'm going to try and share my screen, so if you can let me know if it works, that would be cracking.
Yep, it's working.
Brilliant.
Is that better?
Yes, splendid. Phew.
Oh, sorry about that. Technical hitch. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be speaking with you today on this topic of such great concern and importance to us all. I'm Tim Powell.
And I'm Georgie.
And we both work for the UK National Archives in the Archives Sector Development Department.
Okay, so just briefly, this is going to be an interactive presentation, not too much, I promise. So we will have a few Menti polls asking for your views. You can access the Menti by going to the web address www.menti.com and entering the code that you see on the screen, and it's also in the chat. There's also a link in the chat if you're opening it from a web address. And I've also put up a QR code briefly in case you're using a smartphone and want to do it that way. The code will be at the top of all of the mentees that come up too. So if you haven't managed to get it up yet, you've still got a chance.
Thanks. As you may know, the National Archives has leadership responsibilities for all archive services and holders in England, from national institutions to private archives, including community archives. One of our aims is to ensure that all those with responsibilities for archives have the skills, knowledge and confidence to manage records and the risks to them. Our approach is collaborative, and we often work with networks such as the Community Archives and Heritage Group to advance our aims. The Climate Heritage Network has already been mentioned. In 2020, the National Archives joined this support network of culture and heritage organisations, together committed to aiding their communities in tackling climate change.
So to the first of our interactive questions, and I'm really hoping this works. So we're thinking about your archives and climate change, and we'd really like to get a sense of where you're at. We'll ask this again at the end, but for now, are you thinking about climate change? Are you worried or anxious? Have you actually prepared or are beginning to prepare? And have you got some ideas? You should be able to see, oh, that's exactly what I wanted to happen. I was going to mention that all polling is anonymous, so feel free to say what you think. And we should be able to see the sliders move as more people submit. So we'll just spend a minute or so. I can see there's quite a lot of worry and anxiety, which probably reflects some of the news that there's been, those disaster reports that Hannah mentioned at the beginning. But it's really interesting to see that some of you have got some preparations, some ideas in place. Certainly, I've been quite inspired listening to the talks we've heard today about what people are already thinking about. Quite exciting. But yeah, lots of thoughts and worries. We've had 26 people submit, so I'll give it a few more seconds. I think it's landing in quite similar areas. People are filling in the same boxes. This is very good that the Menti works. Okay, we've had a minute, so I will move on. But yeah, please feel free to join in if you would like to. Okay.
Thanks very much. That was there were some interesting figures there. This conference is timely. Membership of the Climate Heritage Network requires us to plan for potential heritage loss resulting from climate change, and it's important that we in the archive sector are preparing for these challenges. So in the short time we have, we're going to introduce an approach that we are talking about at the National Archives and possibly hoping to develop with the wider sector. The range of archive services in the UK is great in terms of resources of staff, buildings, finances, and so on. But one thing we all have in common is the need to assess the risks that affect the collections we hold. So to our title, All is Hazard. Is there no plan? The principal hazards to collections are often identified as fire, water, an unsuitable environment, exposure to light, pests and mold, pollution, theft, vandalism and damage. We try to ensure our collections are protected from such hazards, as the material in our care is, we know, vulnerable from sources seen and sometimes unseen.
So, having thought quite generally about risks, what are some of the risks for your collections to get you thinking about where you're at? Are they the ones we've just listed? Please feel free to add those in. We'd like to know. Is there something particular about one of them? Is it not just a water risk, but you're on a floodplain? Is your building particularly susceptible to pests? So we'd like to take a minute just to think about your context, and I'm hoping some words will appear this time, which is slightly more slightly more complicated. if the Menti works. Oh, flooding, yeah. Lots of flood, 2 floodings, 2 for flood. I think that's definitely something that I've seen a lot more of in the last couple of years. Dampness because of a basement, the classic archival storage location. Data virus, oh, that wasn't on our list. Very good. And indeed, computers and digital and flooding. Yeah, I look after archives in London where there's lots of issues with floods. Damp increased insect breeding and plague of moths. That is horrifying. A plague of moths sounds particularly bad. Humidity, an impairment to fabric, fluctuation. There are a lot of risks. Energy outage. That one is, yeah, feeling a lot more potentially strong than perhaps it did. Some really interesting things coming up here. And it's really, yeah, good to see how you think about in terms of your own archive. Landslide, that one I had not considered. Probably less likely in London, although I might be wrong about that. Computer corruption, sorry, they're sort of flowing around me, so it's quite interesting to see. Thank you so much to everyone who's put a risk on. I will move on. We will keep, by the way, these answers, though they are anonymous, so it's really useful for us to see. All right.
Thanks. It was interesting to see some of those answers. Some are very common ones. Some are quite new. Work commissioned by Historic England observed that climate change should be viewed as a risk multiplier, heightening dangers that are already present. So I'm now going to quickly run through some of these risks and briefly outline how climate change might be a risk multiplier for them. There is, of course, uncertainty about the timing and effects of climate change. Even in the UK, there will be considerable regional and local variations. However, let's start with the key characteristic associated with climate change, rising temperatures. In the last few decades, temperatures have all markedly increased, particularly in summer, with summer temperatures over 30 degrees centigrade now commonplace in southern England. Rising temperatures in themselves need not be too much of a problem, but they can bring with them a variety of risks. Let's start with the threats to buildings. British buildings are designed for thermal comfort in a temperate climate with winter heating and maximisation of sunlight. Thermal discomfort in summer has not traditionally been much of a problem, but this is changing. Archives may be housed in vulnerable historic buildings, where changing conditions may result in more instability in temperature and thus in relative humidity. As we know, such fluctuations are damaging, particularly to composite materials. Fire risks. Research by the University of Reading indicates that as a result of climate change, the extremely arid conditions that can encourage major wildfires could occur much more often. In some places, for example, those adjacent to heathland, this could be a particularly significant risk. Then there's rising sea levels. The mean sea level around Britain has risen by about 17 centimetres since the start of the 20th century. This is already endangering some coastal settlements. Flooding will become more common in coastal areas and along estuaries and river valleys. Extreme weather has been mentioned. One consequence of climate change is a significant increase in rainfall. 2009 to 18 was on average 5% wetter than preceding decades. Furthermore, the amount of rain on extremely wet days seems to have increased. This brings with it a number of risks to archives. Local flooding, water leaks through roofs, rising water tables, and it may affect the immediate relative humidity. Changes in rainfall will, of course, be affected by location. They're largest for Scotland and less significant for southern and eastern England. Studies have also indicated an increase in the number of windstorms and that their intensity will increase during winter. The Midlands, Yorkshire, Northern Ireland in particular should prepare for fiercer storms Such extreme weather may bring roof damage, falling trees and flying debris damaging buildings, and also, as was mentioned, a greater danger of landslides. Moving on from meteorology, let's look at agents of biodeterioration. Again, some of these were mentioned in the previous Menti. Climate change will affect insect life. Some species will struggle, others will prosper. The most common pest in museums, the variegated carpet beetle, seems to reproduce more quickly as temperatures rise, while studies suggest that silverfish could also benefit. Mold. Although studies focus on the threat to human health, the risk to our historic collections posed by mold may well increase. It is predicted that there will be higher levels of fungal spore production, as well as changes in species diversity. Climate change and higher temperatures will increase the generation of some pollutants, including ground level ozone. This is hazardous to human health, but also acts on heritage materials, from paper to paints, and indeed potentially on the buildings in which they are housed. And to add to all these, there are other challenges. Incidents arising from extreme weather could pose additional problems. They're unlikely to happen in isolation. There may be damage to the transport infrastructure, so getting the necessary equipment and supplies you need may be hampered. There may also obviously be personal issues affecting staff and volunteers. And we must also remember that many of these hazards can apply to digital material as well as physical. In fact, they may be more at risk. Electronic systems are vulnerable in a way that physical objects often are not.
So the challenges that climate change could pose may seem at best daunting and at worst completely overwhelming. But it's really important to remember that archivists and other heritage workers have already developed tools to assess and manage risks and to plan how those risks might be mitigated. It's one of the key activities for looking after an archive. So at the National Archives, we've already begun to look a bit at how existing risk assessment approaches, already widely used by archive services, might be adapted as a planning tool in light of climate change. And there are some really good existing resources here. For example, the National Archives website has guides on disaster planning and risk management and protecting archives and manuscripts against disasters. And you can find the links to these on the Community Archives and Heritage Group website. By identifying and highlighting the particular risks, we can begin to assess the hazards in their particular context and plan ahead. One such risk assessment planning tool can be found in the well-known benchmarks for collections care. Another model is the risk assessment of threats template shown here, produced by the Museums Development East Midlands team. And these existing tools can be built on with that multiplier effect from climate change in mind. So one model we've been particularly looking at is Historic Environments Scotland's A Guide to Climate Change Impacts. This looks at two types of response to climate change. The first is resistance, and the second, acceptance. Resistance is an approach that actively seeks to stop the impact or stop it having an effect on your collections, while acceptance is an approach that accepts that change will happen and that the risks may occur, but plans to avert substantial damage. So we've put together a little example of how simple this kind of thing could be. And the key thing we'd say is to think about the risks that will most impact your archives. That's why we asked that question before. So we've had an example here of how this could look. So we've listed the hazard, in this case, increased rainfall. What caused that? Those episodes of extreme weather, as we just explored all the risks. And what makes you particularly vulnerable? Maybe your storage building has a flat roof and the guttering is prone to blocking in the autumn. And then we approach the two potential adaptations. First being resistance. Maybe you institute regular roof inspections and actually clear the guttering of leaves on a regular basis. And then the second, acceptance. What happens if the worst happens? Can you ensure that everything is boxed? Prepare a salvage priority checklist.
As members of community, archive and heritage groups, you may wonder whether you have the resources for this. But actually, risk assessment and planning is simply good practice. something that any collection holding heritage body ought to be doing anyway. And in an emergency, community heritage groups may have some advantages over larger, more established archive services. Your collections will be smaller, with less material to be moved and found temporary homes for. Being independent organisations, you may well be able to act more quickly. You're probably also more used to having to be adaptable and coming up with ad hoc solutions to immediate problems. The nature of such groups in itself ought to encourage cooperation locally and regionally, identify shared risks, such as being in the same floodplain, and where you can share resources, and plan to work together and support each other accordingly.
So this short presentation has, we hope, given a glimpse into how the National Archives has begun to look at one aspect of climate change. We hope it's encouraged you to think about it too. Some of the next steps that we're thinking about are working on more internal initiatives with other people in the National Archives, such as Collections Care, beginning to work on those partnerships with the archive sector throughout the country, continuing to learn from colleagues and organisations in allied heritage sectors and other countries, beginning to conduct more research, and possibly coming out with some forms of guidance. But to return to our interactivity and a Menti question, what might you want to see? Feel free to list the things I've just mentioned. It'd be really good to know if you'd like to see guidance or more things coming from Collections Care, or anything we've missed. This will be very useful for us. Collection Care research. Yeah, I've been talking a bit more to Collections Care, and it's really interesting to hear the kind of where we can cross over, given how allied the professions are. Supporting on developing local networks, that is interesting, especially given what Tim was just saying about identifying those shared risks. Oh, sorry, I've got a video over that one. Guidance to risks on digital records. Yeah, I think the digital element is definitely going to be quite prominent. Funding, yeah, that one's always an issue. Facilitating geographical resilience. I like that phrasing. Emergency planning toolkit, always sensible. How to make the risk plans. I think that's definitely something that as we've shown today is quite an easy practical thing that we can help with. Buildings more sustainable, guidance would be helpful. More examples of current impact. Show stakeholders, yes. Workshops, updating disaster plans and case studies to see what other organizations are doing on a practical level. I really like that one. I think case studies always help people to start taking action. A commitment with measurable aims that the sector can sign up to. Linking with reputable contractors to make building changes, and best practice advice. Thank you so much. Oh, advice, sorry, sort of have to scroll down. Advice, there's more coming in. Advice and resources, supporting development of partnerships. That is my timer going off to say that we've got quite tight time, but it's really nice to see these ideas coming in. And of course, feel free to add anything to the chat because we'll be looking at that later. And then to return again to the question we asked at the beginning, where are you now? It could have not changed at all, and that's absolutely fine. If it has changed, feel free to let us know. And if you didn't manage to fill it in last time, then feel free to do so now. But yeah, because I think we're all thinking about this, and certainly around COP26, the kind of rising conferences such as this one has certainly got me thinking quite a lot more about it. I really enjoy the percentages it comes up with. More ideas. That's quite nice to see. I think that's more. I can't actually remember the stats from the first one. I will be reviewing all this later, don't worry. Yeah, lots of people thinking about it. That's really excellent. I'm gonna move on to our final couple of slides.
Thank you all so much for your ideas and your contributions through the mentees. It's been really helpful for us to look at how some of the responses have come in as we've been speaking almost. The title for this presentation was adapted from a quotation of the novelist John Fowles. There is no plan, all is hazard. and the only thing that will preserve us is ourselves. All may be hazard, but I hope we've shown that we can ourselves plan together to preserve the collections we value so much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. That was really, I think, really instructive, and both in kind of laying out some of the issues and engaging people with those issues, but also beginning to suggest some solutions and also get some from the audience. We've got a minute or two before our next and final presentation. Does anyone wish to make a point, ask a question, can make a comment on what we've just heard? Perhaps people felt that they were interactive in the context of the Menti meeting, because there was a lot of interaction there.
It was really good to see. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I'm going to say thank you to Tim and Georgie, and then move us on to our final presentation, which I'm again really excited to be able to introduce. So this is Professor Vlatko. I hope I've got that vaguely right, from the University of Zagreb, and the other word that I'm always wondered how to say, so I'm going to have a go at Topotec, something like that. Talking on a collaborative portal for archives and communities, and Dr. Lemick is an assistant professor at the University of Zagreb, working as head of the archive office. She's an archive counsellor as well as professor at the archival studies departments in the university. She's actively engaged in various international projects and initiatives in the field of information and archival studies, culture and digital humanities. And she's also the vice president of Icarus, president of Icarus Croatia, and member of the ICA Europca executive board, and a number of other posts, including being a member of the Europeana advisory board. So it's with great pleasure and interest I hand over to Dr. Lemick to talk on Topotec.
So thank you very much for this nice introduction, and I welcome you all. I'm very excited actually to be part of your conference, although I had to excuse myself because I was involved in other live event. But I hope that we will be in touch for this topic in future. I'm here basically as representative of Icarus community, which is from where this Topotec platform generated, and I hope that you will also share this initiative with us more than United Kingdom and in other countries. So basically, what is Topotec? A few words about background of this, why Topotec, why we even bother from archival point of view, and I came as Professor Flynn introduced me from archival world, work as in National Archives for a long time. And what are some principles with the archival world that we are now going share in digital era? Trends regarding interoperability, networking, integration, finding alternative partnerships, crowdsourcing, openness, online archive. And we are approach these issues from the viewpoint of serving the society, how archives can serve the society. This is basically also the values of Icarus community that I'm representing here today. So this is the association found in Vienna in 2008, interdisciplinary by the nature, also generated from the archives. So we have now about 200 members from 35 countries, archives, scientific institutions, faculties, libraries, museums, IT expert associations. And basically today, the idea of interdisciplinary approach is not new. In 2008, actually, it was quite new. Also, as idea from which we are generating our activities, and this is to introduce digital tools in work of archives and heritage institution, and to open it and to share it to the community. So this is basically what we do. In last 10 years, we start lots of projects. We are quite active. Some things that we do that you can find on our webpage and social media networks. We have magazine, we have European Archival blog, we have National Association, Friends Association, we have about 15 various international projects on large scale, from Creative Europe, from Interreg, from Citizen Science, from various platforms. We have some very important strategic partnership in Archival Board. So we are member of Archives Poltar Europe Foundation. We are, Icarus is one of the founders of Time Machine, the hottest initiative in archival world and digital humanities right now. We are also partner of Urbica. We have various working group and various activities. And as you see from this little background, our approach is really interdisciplinary, and we put it all the time, and I have to put it all the time. So what are some principles of our activity? Flexibility, openness, and solidarities. This is really what are the bases on which we go to our work. What is our core business and what is our core activities? In last 10 years, we started a few online platforms. The first one is Monasterium, which grew to be the largest virtual archive of medieval and early modern charters in the world. You see here the numbers of images, charters, institutions. So this is basically the thematic portal came from institutions and based on various institutions and repositories. Then we started Matricula. This is a registered book portal. And we now came to more than 20 million digital images from 8 countries on this portal. And it's all these platforms are open. The Topotec is our last initiative, our last virtual platform, community platform. So basically it's quite different from these 2 platforms which collect materials from various institutions. Topotec materials came from majority of private hands and from private resources and collections. This is basically local history virtual archive, and we just published last month our 1 million digital images. So now I think that we are now the largest community platform in the Europe. How the Topotec was created and how it started. It started from one Creative Europe project called Community as Opportunity, with intention to make some connection and bonds between heritage institutions and communities they operate within. We had lots of activities inside this project. It was really a large project with 17 partner institutions that came during the period of project. We get more than 70 associated partners, and we want to make community involvement, and we got to have some interaction with communities. So Topotec was one of the tools created inside this project. As much as other activities like Bring Your History Days, Adventures in the Art Fairs, we have digitization, we have momathons and mom schools. We really wanted to evolve community in the archival world and resources, and we really do it till day. So this is basically how it looks like. So what is new and what is innovative and what we start with this platform? So it's collaborative and it's participatory and it's voluntary, it's interactive. We wanted to assure access to private, local, and often forgotten sources, and we wanted to gather communities around this idea. The basic idea is, as you can read here, to include more citizens in preservation and promotion of local history, and basically also to connect local heritage institutions with users and make solid ground for further activities and for joint work on this issue. So it's basically a tool for creating virtual collections of history, of theme, or any other idea that you can see. We now have more than 350 collections from 17 countries. Actually, 2 months ago, we got first British Topotec, not British, but from the United Kingdom, from Scotland. And actually, I hope that from this, you can see what type of platform activity this is. So what it basically do, it allows you to digitize materials, to publishing, photos, documents, prints, audio records, and then you use tool to map it on the chart. And it's also interactive, so people can ask questions and get discussion about various materials and various topics. But also this description is based on some archival standards. So this is how it looks like. This is what you can find. So you can search, you will find on the Topotec portal a list of all Topotecs by countries, by names, by regions, in various languages. Now there are 17 languages on Topoteca page. As you see, you can put material, you then describe every record, you then put it on the map. You can search it by various criteria, by geographic name, by tags, by type of material, by timeline. You can make various topics, and you can make various thematic collections. If you would like, you can also put QR codes inside. You can put description. Every material that you can find of the Topotec is licensed, so it's published with permission of material owner, and you can choose your own Creative Commons license or type of use this material. You can download it or just browse it or reuse it again. So we find to be quite flexible. You see, you can find various languages here. You can find various material here. Topotec is run, these 350 plus collections are run by really various people and various institutions. We have Topotec, which are run by primary schools, by high schools, by faculties, by student groups, by local communities, municipalities, associations, institutions. So it's really very easy to start this collection, to collect your associates around you and to engage various user groups around it, and also to create various activities around this tool. So it's really just up to the imagination of this institution or administrator running the Topotec. How administration interface looks like. People who work in Topotecs, as you see, it's very easy to upload material and to describe this material. It's very easy to operate, since we have operators, as I said, from school children to senior citizens. Everybody can gather and start to work. We also have user manuals in English and in German, and we also now work on other languages. So you can find it online in the system, how to use it. And we also work on this platform in further development. So after the project and the COP project, when it initially started, the Topotec, we use this Topotec and we really grow it more for various other activities and for various other projects. So for example, as you can see, this is the list of the projects which now run on Topotec and work with Topotec platform. This is leader projects. This is run in Austria and in Finland. And this is the project for social inclusion in rural environment, in rural landscape. When they start Topotec in a way to bring local rural communities about some cultural event and to help them to save their history and to save their records in this type of activities. Then we have Creative European Archives as Innovative Cultural Hubs project that we use Topotec. This is also one project of the Creative Europe. We use the Topotec to make new collection and to use it for other project activities like platform stories from archives, like virtual exhibition, like digital storytelling, and various other activities. Then we also have now second running Creative Europe project, They Live. This is the platform for starting, for documenting students' life around the Europe. And we use this platform to connect memories of student life in student campuses all around Europe and to use it for various cultural practice and to save some memories that which find it's not saved in any other institution. Then we also have some other initiatives and activities. And this is the event that was really, that we was really very pleased with, that last year Topotec got Best European Cultural Practice Award. And European Union put it in European Heritage Strategy for 21st Century as one of the best cultural practice, which was really very good for us, and which we used to grow more activities around Topotec and to start also some new technical and all other developments. Then Topotec is very active in Citizen Science Association, and it's used very much around citizen science project. It also got some awards in Austria and other countries, but also we use it for one new event and one new initiative that started, and this is Time Machine project, which ran as this initiative started as one large-scale research innovation platform project, and we now use it for building local time machines platform, and we really try with Topotec to use it and to connect it and make some interoperability with various platforms and initiatives that we can use it on, and in a way to collect private material and public material. This is some professional strategy, not just professional strategy, but also this initiative you can find in another cultural and creative strategies and projects going on so far. And this is to try to build a complete history, to mix and to collect and to compare private and public sources that lots of public cultural heritage institutions are now involved in. So this was basically some brief introduction from me. Please see it on our platform. Please share it. Please ask us any questions. If you have it on this picture, I have to just point out, this is a guy who is called Alexander Shatek, and he is actually the founder of Topotec, and he runs the Topotec. Icarus Association is in charge for technical development and administration, and all our members and all our associates really work very hard with all amateurs and all user groups and public interesting in this in various countries. So we give support in organizing events, in education, in promote local history sources, in try to put some professional support for local historians, for people interested in it, for local communities that don't have any cultural institution around or have it and need the help. So basically this is initiative to help us save private sources and to open it to the public in order to be more accessible and to see how basically the history of common people look like. So thank you very much for opportunity to present it to you, and I'm very open for your questions.
Thank you very much. That was really really interesting and a really good introduction to something that I don't think that is well known within the UK. Although I think there will be a speaker talking about one of their projects on Topotec in the Scottish conference in a couple of weeks, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. I've got some questions from Sir Alan, I think, has got his hand raised.
No, sorry, that was just me clapping. It was supposed to be me clapping anyway. No, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Is it possible if you could just say a little bit about how people could get involved with it if they were interested? What would be the kind of process?
So the processes you can find of Topotec portal page. You have the instructions how to register the Topotec, how to start the Topotec if you are interested. So basically you have guidelines for this, then you have to register for this, and this is some kind of contract for this, because as administrator you have some responsibility for the content for this. But basically, since you can reach out all available Topotecs and collections, you have impressum and contact of each for each collection of their administrator. You can reach, because it's interactive, you can find the materials which post questions like, do you know the year, do you know the place, do you know something about this record? And then you basically respond for this question, and then the administrators of the collection see your input, and they get in touch with you to ask you, do you want to share materials, do you have some information? So you can either involve in teams, in topics that are already available, or you can start their own collection. So it's quite easy to start and register if you are interested. And we provide education and support, either technical and professional, in order how to describe it, how to digitize it, how to do it with it, whatever you are interested to do, and whatever kind of activities you are involved in development.
Emily, you've got your hand up.
I see here some questions. Are there any costs involved in taking part? There are some cost, annual fee for running Topotec. You can see it also in the instruction guidelines, since basically running, depending on the country, from 300 to 500 euros per year. So this is really to help us with technical provision, to provide servers and internet and technical support for this. Although inside our activities, we help the, I don't know, local association or those who are not have financial resources for taking part even for this type. This is why we're running various projects to help those who don't have any financial resources for run it. And files are stored centrally. The servers are in Vienna. And also you can have local copies whenever you want. So basically for this material, which is digital and stored in Topotec storages, this is basically like one more copy for you to prevent you for some, I don't know, technical problems with your material. You have it. So this is basically like you have one stored copy in other digital repository, which is saved and kept for you.
Thank you, Emily. When you were speaking before, we couldn't quite hear you, so I maybe try again.
Right, that's because I didn't have my microphone down. Okay. Funnily enough, Vladka has just raised the question that I was going to ask, which was about the archive value of the digital repository. So does it meet an digital archive standard? Because that would be incredibly useful for these kinds of records. I put a link to the Castell Werin, which is a Welsh online repository, but that at the moment doesn't meet an archive standard. So there are issues around
this is why we try also to provide some professional input for these standards as you speak. So the description is made by ISADG. If people who made description, they are not know that this description is made, these files are made by international archival standard. Also for technical quality, in these guidelines, in manuals, you have provision for any type of material. So this is the quality, this is in which type, in which size, you have to make this digital copy for audio material, for photography, for document. So basically we also educate them to make your virtual archive by some basic or adventure standard, not to put it like, you know, on Facebook group, but to make everything by standard. This is why we provide manuals and education. And this is why we try to provide connection between local cultural institution and local private collections, that they have some insight and they knowledge also about that you have to do it by some standards for digitalization process, as well for description process and for documenting material, and also for publishing and reuse. This is why we have Creative Commons license, and you have to have permission for copyright and for any other materials. So we basically also try to learn them how to run their collections or everything they do, to learn something basic about standard of protection and description and using historical material.
That just sounds brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Or I will draw things to a close and say thank you to Vladka in particular, just for that last really excellent overview of Topotec, and I think encourage us all to kind of go and have a look a bit more, and to thank all our other speakers for what I think has been a really excellent evening. I just want to, if Audrey is still here, I just wanted to see whether she wanted to say anything about the Scottish Conference. I know something's been put in the chat, and then open it to Alan, perhaps to also say something about the next, or Jane about the next Community Archives event. So Audrey.
Hi, hello. Can everyone hear me? Yes. I can't really see me, but anyway, yes, so Cache Scotland are continuing the theme of today's talk. It lines in with COP26. As you know, it's happening in Glasgow, so it was a great opportunity. Cache Scotland is a regional group. It's part of Cache, but it just represents groups within Scotland. So we, you know, feed into the main group, and you can come along on to Glasgow. I know that's very difficult for quite a lot of people that don't live nearby. So we're also live streaming the main presentations. Our focus is very much on climate change and how that affects communities. I think the link that I put in the chat will give you all the information you need. You do need to sign up if you do want to come and listen to the main presentations. We will have workshops and posters, and we'll have a variety of pop-up displays, which unfortunately you won't get if you live stream the event, but you will be there in some way. So hope to see lots of you there. And as I say, there's been more information about Topotec from the Friends of Kinloch Castle.
Yes, this is our first Topotec from UK.
Yeah, so Thomas Krebs from Switzerland is coming to talk, actually. So that'll be, yeah, can't wait to hear more about it.
Excellent, thank you, Audrey. Alan, do you want to say a few words about the next event and the
yes,
awards?
I can do. Yeah, it's in a strange sort of way, but as Jane said at the beginning, it's almost the second half of this event. So normally in our sort of real world live conferences, we'd spend a day having very interesting speakers as we've had this evening, but also doing our AGM, announcing the award winners, and then giving our award winners chance to speak somewhat around the wonderful work that they do. So we've split that in half. So in 2 weeks' time, sort of same time and sort of same place on Zoom at 5 o'clock, we'll be having our AGM, which I know isn't the most exciting thing I can sell you, but I'm sure you'll really enjoy. We have a fun AGM, but perhaps even more interesting than that, and definitely more interesting than that, to be honest, we'll be announcing the winners of our CAJ Awards for 2021. Well kept secret currently at the moment, but we have 3 groups that are going to talk to you about why they've won Best Group for Community Engagement, Best Group for Dealing with Wellbeing, and Best Group for Gathering and Preserving Heritage. So we're really excited to hear them, and it would be lovely for you to hear why we think they're so wonderful. So hopefully you'll join us in 2 weeks' time.
Okay, well, thank you, Alan. And I think unless Jane wants to say any final words, I think that's probably it. And probably just down to me to just once again thank everybody who spoke and everybody who's kind of attended and participated. It's been great. I mean, we are definitely all looking forward to doing this face to face as soon as possible. But this has been a really excellent alternative and not diminished by being online. So it's great to be able to make these contacts and to have people from all over attending our Community Archive conference. So thanks very much. I see Jane is there, so maybe she is going to say a final word.
Really just to say thank you to everybody, because it's been a really excellent evening. Thank you very much to all our speakers and to you all for joining us.